CosmicSkeptic's recent video is a great illustration of why so many perfectly intelligent people take issue with Jordan Peterson. But, as a Peterson fan myself, I'm going to show you why I think much of what Alex O'Connor puts forward is completely unconvincing. There are many criticisms in Alex's video, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. So instead, I'll just go after what I think is the most significant accusation that underpins all of Alex's criticisms. The one that atheists seem to repeat ad nauseum. That Jordan Peterson deliberately and unjustifiably misuses religious language to obscure and mystify his real beliefs.
But Peterson insists that a scientist's motivation has to be that they'll be set free by it, and that this will be redemptive. Why would he choose these terms?
So as a scientist, you have to posit the existence of the ontological transcendent before you can move forward at all. But more, you have to posit that contact with the ontological transcendent, annoying though it is because it upsets your apple cart, is exactly what will in fact set you free. So then you accept the proposition that there is a transcendent reality, and that contact with that transcendent reality is redemptive in the most fundamental sense, because if it wasn't, well, why would you bother making contact with it? You're going to make everything worse or better?
Again, like transcendent, I think that he's purposefully using religiously charged language to make his quite straightforward observation seem like it has religious significance, where it in fact does not.
Now, at first glance, this seems like a perfectly reasonable critique, and there is absolutely room for disagreement about whether or not the scientific method is embedded in a religious ethic or not. I think it's a corollary discussion stemming from Hume's notion that you cannot derive an ought from an is. But let's put that aside for a moment to address the more important claim here. Alex asserts that there is no justification for Jordan Peterson using religious language when much clearer and more straightforward language is available.
In conclusion, I think that we should stop allowing Jordan Peterson to get away with a vagueness of language that we wouldn't accept in any other context.
And to that, I would simply ask, what are you talking about? There's no justification for Jordan Peterson using religious language in the way that he does. I can think of at least one. As you probably noticed, many Christians have become fans of Jordan Peterson recently. His use of religious language has no doubt allowed him to garner this audience, and I suspect that many atheists believe Peterson's alleged language games are specifically intended to do just that. And if that's the case, what do you think Peterson is doing to the fundamentalist worldview when he tells them that they're swallowing a bunch of lies and denying basic scientific realities?
Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And if you're on the fundamentalist side, you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard. And like, it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but, you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology.
So what's the justification for Peterson using religious language? How about doing so allows him to Trojan horse the theory of evolution into the fundamentalist worldview, thus destabilizing it?
I think that Revelation is a psychedelic account. Literally.
Oh, the book of Revelation.
I really believe that. You bet.
And therefore allowing him to effectively push back against religious dogmatism, which is exactly what atheists like CosmicSkeptic spend a significant amount of their time justifiably doing. This isn't the only justification for Peterson using religious language, but it is an important one, and one that fans of Peterson like me have no problem seeing. So I really just have to ask, what is with all the mildly dramatic pearl clutching from Alex?
Okay, what? I mean, seriously.
Forgive the psychological speculation I'm about to do here, but I want to be as honest as possible in what I think is going on. I suspect that Alex has received many emails from people who were abused at the hands of religious ideologues. Whether it's gay people who were manipulated by their church or mosque into believing that they had some sort of disease, or just people who questioned the faith and were ostracized for it. And I suspect that Alex has received a lot of genuine gratitude for making videos that provided these people the intellectual tools to push back against their abusers. As a result of this, Alex has probably developed a heuristic of sorts in which he reasonably assumes that anyone who is sympathetic to religious fundamentalists should be approached with a heightened degree of caution.
And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists.
This is why I think you have to be duly cautious when dealing with Jordan Peterson.
But by being overly cautious and, in my opinion, overly critical, Alex misses the forest for the trees and fails to notice that the consequences of Peterson's actions are leading to the same anti-dogmatic outcomes that Alex values, which is what led to the development of the heuristic that causes Alex to be skeptical of Peterson in the first place. I don't blame Alex for being confused and annoyed by Peterson's choice of language. But if you believe it's important to push back against religious dogma, then I think Peterson's usage of religious language is justified on those grounds alone. Unless you think that Peterson advocating for the theory of evolution and telling people that being gay is not actually a sin.
You know, if someone's saying, well, I'll cure you of your homosexuality, it's like, well, it's not a disease, first of all, and so it doesn't need a cure, and probably you can't do that anyways.
Are things that reinforce the fundamentalist worldview, in which case you have some explaining to do. But perhaps you would say there are more important considerations than just pushing back against religious fundamentalism. You might object to Peterson's mystical and metaphorical use of language because it isn't straightforward and it doesn't provide us the clarity we need on important philosophical issues. Here's Cosmic Skeptic providing an example of this apparent obfuscation.
Just think about it for a second. Imagine that I were on a road trip and I were reading a map, and then I claimed that because this map informed me of something that I didn't already know, the map didn't just inform me or help me direct my car, no. The map set me free from my ignorance after I contacted the ontologically transcendent, that is, the directions that were outside of my knowledge, and this has been redemptive in the sense that it's made things better for me. I'm now going in the right direction. That's the idea that you're being sold here. I really hope that you can see through it now. The thing that Peterson is actually describing when he talks about how science works is about as straightforward and banal as my description of how a map works. But just by dressing it up in this religious imagery, he makes it sound a lot more profound than it actually is if you're not listening carefully.
Let me demonstrate why I think this analogy badly misses the point. Of course, in day-to-day life, using religious language might be poetic, but it likely would do nothing but confuse the person you're talking to and make them think you're a pretentious douche, as Alex so eloquently demonstrated. But what happens when you're not dealing with mundane issues like reading a map? What if you're dealing with issues that are the most consequential a human being could possibly face, matters of life and death or good and evil? It turns out that as a clinical psychologist with 30-some years of experience, Peterson has some insights about the usefulness of religious language that naive people such as myself and Alex are in no real position to dispute.
Well, it's been my experience as a clinician that the more serious the events that you're discussing with people, the more the language shifts towards what you might describe as the religious. So, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a good example, or cases of serious abuse, child abuse, or like truly reprehensible interactions between people. To treat someone in a situation like that, you have to help them develop a philosophy, I would say, but probably a theology of good and evil, because you have to investigate the structure of the motivation for malevolence. And you can't do that outside the confines of religious language. And I should say, in keeping with that, I've had a number of war vets come up to me after my recent talks and tell me that watching my lectures has cured their post-traumatic stress disorder.
So let's think for a moment. Is Jordan Peterson deliberately using religious language about the ontologically transcendent battle of good and evil just to obfuscate his views so he can sell more books to religious people? Perhaps. But perhaps after decades of witnessing firsthand the clinical utility that religious language provides, especially when it comes to treating horrifically complex psychological issues like PTSD, Peterson believes it's reasonable to use the same language when discussing horribly complex philosophical issues like the nature of good and evil or the epistemological underpinnings of morality. You know, things that are a bit more complex than reading a map. But, as I said, even if I disagree with the claim that using religious language is a form of obfuscation, I still think it's perfectly reasonable to maintain a distrust of Peterson even if you approach him with an open mind. It's exactly what you'd expect to do, especially after watching the following clip from Alex's video.
Well, did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was, not only did they happened in a meta manner, they're still happening.
Look, I get what Peterson is saying. The story of Exodus describes a struggle with tyranny and the aftermath of liberation, and these are themes that are still relevant and true today. But Peterson is smart enough to know that he's being asked a simple historical question. Did the events historically occur? Regardless of how true the message is today, did the events described actually happen? I mean, just compare these two responses.
When I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened.
See? How hard was that? Those precise events never happened, but the characterizations are deeply true.
When I look at a story like Cain and Abel, I think, well, the question, did that happen, begs the question, what do you mean by happen?
For some reason, when the fictional story in question is a scriptural story, Peterson becomes unable to describe it as fiction in the way that he would describe literally any other meaningful but ahistorical story as fiction.
Again, there is a separate discussion to be had about the difference between truth and metatruth, but the claim that Peterson can appear vague with his choice of language is valid. In fact, the following clip from his debate with Sam Harris is, I think, the most obvious example of this annoying evasiveness.
Someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said, it would take me 40 hours to answer that question. How's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
It's a fine answer, and people have been giving that answer for a very long period of time, but the idea doesn't seem to go away.
I honestly don't know why he doesn't answer this probabilistic question in a straightforward way, because even if he does think there's some possibility that Jesus was resurrected, saying almost certainly not still leaves that door open, so I get why people have a problem with him. My guess is that Peterson doesn't want to alienate religious people who could otherwise be convinced to let go of some of their more extreme religious dogma, and so he's not worried about offending atheists by using religious language, which has proven to be an effective way to communicate to millions of people. And admittedly, if I was not already bias in favor of Peterson, and I had not spent many hours digging into his lectures and interviews, then I more than likely would have seen that response to Sam and come to the same conclusion that CosmicSkeptic and other atheists have. Does this mean I don't think you can make valid criticism of Jordan Peterson unless you've watched all his lectures? Of course not. He's an out-of-touch boomer with a pathological addiction to Twitter that is rapidly undermining whatever credibility he's established in the past. He deserves to be criticized. But if you're going to tell me with a straight face that all Jordan Peterson does is spew pseudo-profound word salad dressed in religious language, and people like me are just too ignorant to see that, well, to quote my favorite work of fiction, remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly enough to remove the speck from your brother's. And so with that, good luck, and Godspeed.